Whether a game console is considered a hit or a failure, I find myself drawn to each of them all the same. There's always at least that one game on any platform that makes it worth owning. Such is the case with Nintendo's Wii U. Now granted, the Wii U has more than just one great game, but the console itself certainly wasn't a smash hit. One of the best reasons to own a Wii U, however, arrived in 2015 with the original Splatoon. This is effectively Nintendo's take on the third-person shooter genre with its own unique twist, the paint system. It's a game that oozes style, almost like Nintendo's take on a theoretical Sega Dreamcast game. Splatoon would go on to become one of the best-selling games on the entire platform. Now, Nintendo found a lot more success when it launched the Switch in 2017, and naturally, Splatoon was not far behind, with a sequel, Splatoon 2. It feels familiar in many ways, but the fleshed out single player mode was certainly welcome, and the expansion was excellent to boot. Now, 5 years after that game, we finally have a new installment with Splatoon 3. This game arrives late in the Switch's cycle, however, so it begs the question, what kind of changes can we expect? Well, it turns out, quite a lot. Not to discount Splatoon 2, which is excellent in its own right, this third game feels like a full and proper sequel, building on what made the original game so great in the first place while expanding in new directions. So for today's video, I'd like to walk through some of the reasons why I feel that way, compare and contrast with the original Splatoon games, going more in depth with its single player campaign, and talking about its performance characteristics. So let's get into that. Right away, the presentation instantly feels more elaborate. The single player mode is vast and the visuals have all improved. It really feels like this is the game they've been working towards since the beginning, and it's evident from the moment you first boot the game. To better understand this though, we need to look back at the prior versions. So on Wii U, when you start the game for the first time, it kicks off with this basic menu. You can customize your characters by choosing through a number of options, and it's demonstrated using the 3D model on the side. Once you complete this, however, it loads into a separate training map, and it's here where you learn the basics. Splatoon 2 improves upon this by introducing a more dynamic menu with an increased amount of animation for the characters as you cycle through the different options. Once you complete this, then it cuts to a quick title sequence before dropping you into a new training map. Both of these implementations are perfectly fine, but I always feel that the first contact is important for any new game. It gives you that first taste and helps set the stage for what's to come, which is why Splatoon 3's introduction made more of an impact from the start. So this time, it opens with this mysterious desert scene, instantly setting the stage for what's to come. The camera then cuts to your character, and this is where it gets pretty cool. As you select each option, the character then removes a piece of clothing to allow you to select the next one. So once you've selected your character type, they'll then remove their sunglasses, allowing you to select their eye color, followed by removing their hood to choose the hairstyling, so on and so forth. I know, it sounds silly, but this little selection process is so well implemented I just had to highlight it. Once you've finished making your selections then, the camera pans seamlessly over to the starting point before kicking into the game's training mission. Now, this initial stage, though simple, does reveal some nice improvements to the visuals, specifically in regards to the pre-calculated light maps. We're not looking at any fancy new global illumination techniques here, mind you, but look closely, and it does feel as if the developers have done a surprisingly good job in simulating the appearance of diffuse interreflection. Basically, the light from the sun, in this case, that bounces around a scene, triggering color bleeding in the process. If you look at this cutscene here, you can more easily see what I'm talking about. Note the soft orange glow of the sand in the shadowed regions. It is of course all pre-calculated, I have to stress, but it greatly improves overall scene composition and ties everything together. If we look back at the original Splatoon, this is exactly the kind of thing that's missing, giving that game a harsher, more drab appearance. Which makes this a good time for a comparison, don't you think? So this is Hammerhead Bridge from the original Splatoon, and that same map is also featured in Splatoon 3. Only it's not really the same, it just carries the same name. Look at it this way, in Splatoon 1, the bridge area is under construction with grates and slats, and it's even missing the upper deck. In Splatoon 3, however, work on the bridge has been completed. So we can't exactly compare the structure of the map here, but we can examine the lighting. Even though the Wii U version lacks the upper deck and thus is in direct sunlight, if you look around the map in the shadowed areas, they appear somewhat dark and drab. Now check out Splatoon 3. The entire area is more vibrantly lit with sun pouring in and around the bridge. They're basically filling this area with a bounce light, it would seem. It's not a real-time calculation, again, but I do think it's a noticeable improvement over the original game. But alright, let's continue where we left off earlier. After you complete the training, you'll be dropped into the game's hub world in each of the 3 games. Splatoon 1 and 2 plop you into different parts of Inkopolis, but each square in those games is relatively similar in terms of overall size and scope. These are small areas running at 30 frames per second with an increase in resolution and detail. This is where you'll access all the different modes and shops available. Splatoon 3 kinda shakes things up then, with Splatsville, the City of Chaos. It functions much the same as prior games, but the visual fidelity and the size of the area has been greatly increased. Compared to Inkopolis, I'd wager that this hub is about 4 times larger. And there is a lot more to discover throughout, including, by the way, the option to use the recon mode on most of the main maps, rather than being limited to whatever's in the current multiplayer rotation, so that's useful. Before we jump into any of the modes though, perhaps now is a good time to talk about the image quality. As Tom noted in his preview video, there's really 2 things here worth mentioning: the dynamic resolution range and the use of AMD's Fidelity FX FSR 1.0. Resolution-wise, it's pretty simple. Splatoon tops out at a native 1080p using dynamic resolution scaling to ensure smooth performance, and as Tom noted, I also counted around 820p in docked mode. In portable mode, however, it tops out at 720p, with DRS dropping to roughly 75% of that. The key here though is that it manages to reach and maintain its maximum pixel count a lot more often than you'd expect, especially in portable mode where it usually looks to be native 720p during average gameplay. As a result, Splatoon 3 is noticeably clearer than your average Switch game as of late. What's interesting here is that you can easily see the dynamic scaler in action in certain scenes due to the lack of pixel treatment. So check it out. During the game's introduction scene, right as the camera cuts, watch the resolution change in real time. Didn't catch it? Alright, let's slow that down. So on the first cut, we initially see a native 1080p image, but watch as we move through the following frames. You'll note that with each new frame, the pixel count is reduced slightly until the frame time is deemed safe by the game. As a reminder, at 60 frames per second, each frame must be ready within 16.7 milliseconds. So dynamic scaling basically requires the game to make adjustments once the frame time crosses a certain threshold. That's what we're seeing here. But what about FSR 1.0 then? Is that why it looks this way? Well, FSR is listed within the license section on the Switch's main menu, so it is very likely used here, but it does not seem to bring much to the table. The thing you need to keep in mind is that FSR 1.0 is not anti-aliasing, it is a spatial upscaler only. The problem here is that Splatoon 3 itself does not use any form of anti-aliasing, which unfortunately is rather common in Nintendo games. They may be using it in combination with their dynamic resolution scaling algorithm, but I can't say that it actually benefits in any significant way. The only reason it appears sharper than your average Switch game is because the pixel count is generally higher, but FSR 1.0 does not increase the pixel count. Okay, so back to the hub world then. We have 2 main areas to look at here, the multiplayer arenas and the single player mode. Alas, while producing this video, multiplayer access was extremely limited, but thanks to the recon mode, it's still possible to share a few more comparisons with the original Splatoon and Splatoon 2. So let's kick off with Mahi Mahi Resort from Splatoon. This one is set within a large swimming pool, and like the bridge map, the layout is completely different in Splatoon 3, making comparisons difficult. What we can do, however, is examine things like the water. So on Wii U, they use this warbling polygon mesh for the water surface, combined with shaders to create a really nice looking water surface. Below that surface, a caustics texture is used to give the illusion of light penetration through the water surface. In Splatoon 3, these elements remain true, but the actual visual implementation does seem to differ significantly, including the addition of improved reflection textures. This level really demonstrates issues I have with the lighting on Wii U though. Once the water level drops, these metallic panels reveal themselves, and it doesn't really gel with the almost neon glowing water surface. It creates this overly contrasty and unrealistic look. Splatoon 3 though, while very different design-wise, offers a more visually pleasing presentation all around on this specific map. Okay, but how about another stage? Well, this one is a lot closer, though there are still differences. Wii U delivers that high contrast bloomy look that was common during this older generation of consoles. The time of day is also different between the two, ever so slightly, so shadow positions are no longer comparable. Which one do you prefer? Personally, I'm not a big fan of the hazy, overly contrasted look in the Wii U version of this stage myself. There's also changes to the water rendering between the two versions, as you can see in this shot. And if we hop back to the spawn point, we're treated to a brief overhead view of the map. The difference in time of day and contrast once again becomes extremely apparent. Alright, so how about a little Splatoon 2? There aren't many shared maps between the two, but what is shared is a lot closer. The Inkblot Art Academy is a great example of this. The two maps are virtually identical, but that doesn't mean there haven't been some changes in Splatoon 3. The time of day has shifted, lending it a richer orangish hue. Some changes to water rendering are present, as well as glass material, and there's a shift in the way shadows are rendered for certain objects, such as this tree here, which now uses a baked shadow. The general texture work and asset quality is basically the same though. Honestly, Splatoon 2 uses that same stronger bloom effect we saw in the original game with a higher contrast between lit and shadowed areas. The more nuanced baked lighting in Splatoon 3 is, I feel, an improvement. Alright, so let's get into the game itself, shall we? So as I mentioned, multiplayer access was somewhat limited during testing, but as Tom noted in his preview video, performance in that mode is extremely stable and perfectly represents Nintendo doing what Nintendo does best, delivering that locked, stable 60 frames per second even on lower end hardware, at least in its faster paced games like this. Now, as someone that doesn't typically enjoy online multiplayer, I will say that I appreciate Splatoon's approach to it. Matches are super fast paced and over relatively quickly, making it easy to jump in and out as you please. But what he didn't dig into is the single player portion of the game, which is where I feel we see the greatest improvement. Even in the original, this mode offered a lot of fun, but I always felt that it was relatively brief, clocking in at 2 to 3 hours at most. It never really met its full potential. Splatoon 2, specifically with the DLC, definitely improved upon this, but Splatoon 3 takes things even further. Now, I don't want to get into spoiler territory here, but the first few levels suggest one thing similar to those original games, but you quickly discover that the expected threat and objectives of the game are actually quite different, and this leads to a much larger world known as Alterna. It builds on the prior games for sure, but what Splatoon 3 offers is a lot more of everything. There are just so many more stages now, and the variety in these stages is remarkable. You have combat challenges, puzzles, platforming, dodging, mini games, and a combination of all of these elements. There's just so much to see and do this time. Every island now contains more individual levels, and the method of unlocking them involves slowly eliminating this hairy, goopy tentacle stuff that's infested the world. Speaking of which, that highlights one of the new visual features in this game: the shell texture fur applied to this goo and certain enemies. Touch this stuff and you'll receive a good demonstration of how it works. Another nice detail I noticed while playing: there's actual persistence during each session. So what do I mean? Well, Between each stage, you'll explore the islands of Alterna, and that includes spraying paint all over the place. In the original game's hub world, however, this would reset between every stage, so while you could spray down the island, after you return from playing a stage, everything would be reset. In Splatoon 3, that's no longer the case, and everything's kept in memory, so after each level, the world would be exactly as you left it. Now, it doesn't persist if you actually close the game and reopen it, but it remains persistent for each session. Now, I feel that with this amount of stuff to do, Splatoon 3 is worth checking out this time, even if you have absolutely zero intention of engaging with the multiplayer modes. My only real complaint with it at this point is that the cutscene presentation just isn't where I'd like it. There's some amazing shots in here for sure, and some that I can't show, but most of the storytelling takes place in these typical dialogue sequences, which really haven't evolved from the original game. This is definitely one area where I would have liked to have seen some significant improvements. But hey, at least it has some really nice bokeh depth of field during these scenes. Now, of course, the other big technical feature that Splatoon is known for is the paint system, but it doesn't seem to have changed significantly from Splatoon 2. The different paint colors all still blend together very nicely, and swimming through the paint leaves these normal map trails behind, which are persistent until you paint over them. You can even write stuff in them if you want, but really there's not much more to say about this aspect. Now, predictably, in all my testing, I struggled to find any slowdown at all during the game's single-player mode. That's not to say there isn't a possibility of slowdown, that always exists, but this is certainly a case where, by and large, you're not going to need to worry about it at all. It's very, very stable at 60 frames per second. As I alluded to earlier, of course, the game's central hub does run at 30 frames per second, but everything else is 60. Loading times are also relatively brief, taking usually less than 10 seconds and sometimes even faster when moving between different maps and modes. But that's pretty much my experience with Splatoon 3 over the past week or so. While it's not a quantum leap in terms of technology or anything, it's a very polished game that's a lot of fun to play with plenty of content to dig into. It doesn't reinvent the series or anything, but if you enjoyed the prior entries, I think you'll like this one too. So yeah, that's gonna do it for this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to let us know, and we'll see you next time.